Welcome to Swamp Talk, where we wade into the murky waters of Washington, D.C. and beyond. I'm your host, Matt Shoemaker, former DIA and Navy intelligence officer. Here we'll dissect current events, news, international affairs, and of course, the good, the bad, and the ugly of American politics. We'll be bringing on expert guests, unpack complex issues, and cut through the noise to give you the straight story. So buckle up, because things are about to get interesting. Today on our inaugural episode, we're diving headfirst into the political swamp itself. Let's talk about the upcoming presidential elections. President Biden and former President Trump both clinched their respective nominations last week. And despite the fact that Election Day is over 6 months away, the race is already heating up. Now, I won't tell you who to vote for. Obviously, that's going to be your decision. But what I can do is give you some context, some intel, if you will, on the current political landscape. So first, let's look at the national mood. There's a lot of frustration out there. Not exactly a groundbreaking assessment, but, because of inflation being so high, the border crisis being catastrophic, and Biden's foreign policy seems... Well, let's just say there's a lot of debate, to put it diplomatically. This could lead to a wave election where Republicans pick up a significant number of seats in Congress. But as we learned from the 2022 midterm elections, what people tell pollsters versus what they actually do can be two different things. So what are the key issues that voters are likely to focus on? Well, the economy is always going to be the top concern. People want to know how their elected officials are going to address inflation, gas prices, and the overall health of the job market. For instance, just last week, the latest jobs report was released, and it claimed the U.S. economy added 275,000 jobs in February, and unemployment is down to 3.9%. However, if you drill down into those figures, according to Business Insider at least, nearly half of new college graduates are currently working high school level jobs, which will certainly be a drag on the economy. In other words, the majority of jobs being created are not jobs you can traditionally raise a family on. They tend to be lower skilled positions that are being taken by, at least in theory, given their college degrees, they're being taken by a higher educated workforce. That, of course, is going to have a knock-on effect on the wider economy. What many people don't seem to realize is that our workforce and, people in general, we fall into a sort of a bell curve in terms of skilled labor. Dr. Jordan Peterson actually remarks upon this a few times throughout his discussions, and he says that the vast majority of people fall into the middle section, obviously, of that bell curve. And if the majority of your workforce, regardless of skill sets, are competing for the same low-skilled positions, that's going to create a lot of problems for growth. Now, of course, another issue is that we can't ignore is going to be foreign policy. In fact, my expertise resides in international affairs and foreign policy. For almost 10 years, I was an intelligence officer with the Defense Intelligence Agency before I put on the uniform and then joined the U.S. Navy and did the same job, essentially, in uniform. I was operating in the world of spycraft to defend our country, and I had the ambition, at least, to make sure that I was getting my hands dirty on two of the most important problem sets facing our country, specifically Russia and China. So I made myself indispensable to my leadership for that. One of the things that I will say that I learned from that experience was, unfortunately, how stupid our elected officials are when it comes to matters of foreign policy. I was part of a number of what we would call congressional delegations, where congressmen and their staff would come in for a briefing on whatever particular topic they were interested in. And it was certainly eye-opening and I'll say generally disheartening, unfortunately, to see the level of their preparedness or even their understanding regarding those issues. Nevertheless, the war in Ukraine is still ongoing. We're over 2 years from the start of that now, and it's having a ripple effect around the world, especially regarding supply chains. Ukraine was one of the world's leaders in fertilizer exports, so that bottleneck going on is having a knock-on effect for American farmers, to say the least, who now have to pay significantly higher prices for fertilizer to grow the crops Americans buy at the grocery store. Voters are certainly going to want to know how their elected officials plan to handle this crisis. But let's take a look first at the two major parties and two major contenders. President Biden and the Democrats in general are facing an uphill battle. The Democrat Party is led by a dull, clearly inept octogenarian whom no one on the Democratic side was ever excited about, even in 2020. There is certainly an enthusiasm gap between the Democrats and the Republicans. A Mammoth University poll conducted last month actually showed that only 32% of registered voters feel at least somewhat enthusiastic about Biden's candidacy. And that number stands at only 62% about Democrats, or among Democrats, I should say. The same number of registered voters, 32%, say they are at least somewhat confident in Biden's physical and mental ability to be president. Less than a third, less than 1 in 3 people in the entire electorate are somewhat confident in Biden's physical and mental ability to be president. Democrats, for their part, though, according to the poll, claim their confidence in Biden's ability has dropped from 91% in 2020 down to about 72% now. So a 19% drop in about 4 years. The Republicans, on the other hand, of course, are going to be hungry to take back the White House and expand their currently extremely thin majority in the House of Representatives. I believe last I saw, given the amount of people that are retiring, jumping ship, or just resigning from their position itself, I believe the numbers are 218 Republicans, 213 Democrats in the House. So they can only spare a couple votes if they ever want to pass anything. The question for Republicans, though, is can President Trump control himself and control the narrative around him enough, at least, to defeat President Biden this time around? Clearly in 2020, obviously, he wasn't able to control the narrative put out by the legacy media, at least not enough to counteract everything that was going on. I think all of us remember the COVID lockdowns, the election interference by social media corporations, the shock to the economy, and all of the riots that were going on in the country in the summer of 2020. But if this election is going to be about President Biden and his myriad of failures, then I think that President Trump likely wins this race. If the race ends up becoming about President Trump and his obviously abrasive personality, then I think President Biden is in a much better shot for re-election, despite the fact that he's actually not really running on any new policies or anything that he's going to do in the next 4 years. The Democrats, of course, are going to need to find a way to energize their base and convince voters that they're the best party to address the challenges of the country for the next 4 years. And that's why I think you see, especially coming out of the Washington Post just yesterday, an op-ed where the Washington Post called for the resignation of Kamala Harris. Get her off the ticket and replace her with someone who's far more exciting, at least, like a Gavin Newsom or the Michigan governor. But of course, the Republicans, on the other hand, will need to present a united front. They've got a lot of competition and a lot of competing factions within the party. If they can't come together, it's going to cost them at the polls. I think we've seen that over 2022. And we may see it again, depending on how things develop. Of course, there's going to be a lot to unpack here, and we'll be diving deeper into the specific races and issues in the coming weeks and months ahead. So stay informed, get involved, and make your voice heard, because in the end, it's your voice and your vote that counts. Now, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about one of the international stories I alluded to earlier in the show that's on our radar.
With a ceasefire seen as being the best chance of avoiding famine and a worse humanitarian crisis, many countries are pushing hard to get negotiations across the line and to flood Gaza with aid. Now, China has unexpectedly stepped into the Gaza crisis. But it's another meeting between China and Hamas that's raised eyebrows and posed the question, could China rival the US as a potential peacemaker?
What have we heard about this meeting?
Not very much in any great detail from the Chinese side. They just released a statement this morning confirming that Wang Kejian, who is a Chinese ambassador, he's a former ambassador to Lebanon, had held many meetings with Ismail Haniyeh, the leader of Hamas, who's based in Qatar. This is the first meeting between a Chinese official and Hamas since October 7th, since the start of this war in Gaza. And it is quite notable that two things are notable. One is that China, which has not really got involved in negotiating between Israel and Hamas or the other players in this conflict, but it's also notable that it has now decided to do so, met Hamas despite the events of October the 7th and despite the fact that Hamas is, in America and Britain's eyes, a prescribed terrorist organisation. So that is a quite significant move by China to sort of say, hello, yes, we are interested in this conflict. We do have our views, and we are here.
So China is here. We often think about China's international relations as being all about trade. What's changed now?
That image of China being focused on keeping good relations with all parties for the sake of business and trade and development is very much an image that China likes to promote itself. It's not always been the case, of course. China has a long record of political record of involvement in various issues around the world. It's not had a big role in the Middle East, it is fair to say. It's not quite clear how China would ever put skin in the game, if you like. I mean, America has intervened militarily in numerous Middle East conflicts, as we know, over the years. China certainly shows no willingness to take those sort of risks.
As a former intelligence officer who was stationed with U.S. Central Command, which of course looks at the Middle East, and as an intelligence officer who was focused and found my expertise on China and what China was doing in the Middle East, this story certainly got my attention. Chairman Xi Jinping and Communist China has largely dealt with the Middle East purely on an economic level. Almost half of China's oil and gas comes from the Middle East, and it passes straight through the Strait of Hormuz, which is a narrow strip of waterway between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. And for decades, Beijing has stayed out of getting too involved in the mess that is the Middle East. It's really smart on the one hand, and they allow the Americans in the West to get their hands dirty and to spend all that money, all that treasure, and all that blood. And the Chinese get to sit back and just allow the oil to keep flowing for them while the Americans do all the hard work. But this getting involved and meeting with Hamas leadership signals that the Chinese are taking a more active role. And it's surprising, to say the least. Hamas is certainly not an economic powerhouse in the region. Of course, they are funded and backed by the Iranians, so it begs the question, why in the world would the Chinese choose to get involved on this particular topic? Are the Chinese doing the Iranians a favor by trying to help out Hamas? Or are the Chinese thinking they can get an easy win on the international stage by looking like a key player for peace? In one sense, it's actually low-hanging fruit. And I suspect it's more the latter rather than the former. China and Chairman Xi are desperate to be taken as a force to be reckoned with. especially after all of the internal problems the Chinese Communist Party is facing at home. So for more information, check out the website, but that's all for now, and that's all for today's episode of Swamp Talk. Over the coming weeks and months, we will dive deep into the murky waters in Washington and around the world. Thanks for joining me. If you like what you heard, please subscribe to my podcast and leave us a review. We're also on social media, so follow us for the latest updates and join in the conversation. Until next time, this is Matt Shoemaker, reminding you to stay informed, engaged, and drain the swamp one vote at a time.